Welcome back to the Fresh Economic Thinking podcast for 2025. Today, a special guest, Ben Beattie, who runs the Baseload podcast. I've listened to this for many of its 30 episodes. Ben, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Cameron. Pleased to be here.
Mate, maybe you could introduce yourself to the audience. You're an electrical engineer who lives in Brisbane. How did I stumble across you as this very prolific commentator on Australia's energy system?
Thanks, Cameron. I guess it's a bit of an accident of fate. I am an electrical engineer, so I've been through all the uni, and I've, like I say to people when they ask about, qualifications, I am educated, trained, and experienced in the field. More in the wires and the physical part rather than the economic side of it, which is an interesting journey in itself. But I didn't know anything about climate change, or hadn't paid any attention to the so-called transition in inverted quotes there. Until about 2016, 2017, somewhere around there. And I was working fly in, fly out at the time. And I saw something when I was in the camp. I saw something, it might have been the ABC or SBS. I haven't been able to find the actual episode going back through history, but it was kind of like a Q&A panel show.
Yep.
And you had guests up on the stage behind the desk, and then the audience got to ask questions. And one of the people in the audience, this sort of young hefty bloke, he didn't look terribly inspiring. I'm like, oh, what's this guy going to say? I immediately judged him. And then he asked a really good question. He said, what are the solar panels? What are you going to run the place on at nighttime? Because the solar panels won't work. Mm-hmm. And he addressed the question to who I found out was a lady called Amanda McKenzie, who is I think she's in the Clean Energy Council, something like that, Climate Council, one of those things.
One of those new climate organisations that we seem to have many of now.
Yeah, well, I found out, I was naive enough to think that this was some kind of bureaucracy, but I soon found out after hearing her try and put spin on the answer. See, what triggered me was that she didn't just say, no, you're right, solar doesn't work at night, there has to be something else. She kind of tried to put some spin on it. And I'm like, what is this woman talking about? Where is she from? Why is she there? And so then I looked up and found it's just a lobby group for the climate change renewables industry. I'm like, oh, okay. And so then a couple of years later, down the whole rabbit hole, as I'm sure many of your listeners have done at some point on whatever the topic is, but I went down it on climate change and renewables, and then I've ended up here. So I first started complaining about things on Facebook, and my wife said, "Please don't." So I agreed with that, and then what I started doing was like, how do I come to good decisions on energy? And if I've got to cast my vote, how do I make my vote, I guess, make it a high quality vote? And that's kind of where I started. I said, all right, well, let's bottom this out. What are the bottom questions and answers on energy? What are the facts, and where do they come from? And I describe myself, as we were talking before we started, I describe myself as a skeptical of everything. And that's kind of where I started. So I didn't believe any of it. And so when I got down to trying to communicate some thoughts about it, I decided I'd better, if I'm going to write something, then if you write something down, then it lives forever. And so I'd try and make it as accurate as possible and, unbiased and unfiltered. And so then I started writing a newsletter, which was, I don't know, just out of the blue, and I sent it to some friends and colleagues, and then that grew a little bit. But it was kind of hard work. I was doing it monthly, and I called it Energy Rap because not a rap as in I'm gonna go and make movies and songs about it, but as a wrap up of what's going on. And so that got me right into all the newspaper articles and what was going on in the system, and I started finding out more about the actual bureaucracies, the regulators, the market commission, the market operator. At the time, you had COAG, Energy Council, and that evolved into Energy Security Board and these other things. And so I started paying a lot more attention. And I guess the analogy is, if you're going to go out into the world and try and play the stock market, you wouldn't do it seriously if you're going to just nibble at it. You have to go in, jump in up to your neck and immerse yourself in it. And so I've basically done that for the last, I don't know, where are we at, 2025 now, the last 6 or 7 years. And I've just consumed everything about it. So my newsletter lasted about 18 months. And then through some acquaintances out of that, I started writing in The Spectator, Australia, online, which has been well received, which is good. And my wife is a trained journalist. So she's helped train me in writing, which has been beneficial because a lot of people will correctly say that engineers can't write.
Well, I think your articles are pretty good.
Yeah, thanks. I appreciate that.
She's done a good job.
She's beaten me into a submission. There was some nights there where it did drag on a bit, but no, we never swore at each other, I promise. So then out of that, I was thinking about podcasting for a while, and I play music. I play guitar. My son plays music. Pretty much everyone in my family plays music. So I have some audio software, and the audio side of it is really easy for me. So I just thought, well, that's a natural fit. So I just gave it a go, and I'd modeled myself on just the podcasts that I listen to regularly. There's some American ones and some Australian ones, and I'm like, oh, there you go. And so I did one. I think the first one went for about 15 or 20 minutes. And that was when Paul Broad, the former CEO of Snowy Hydro, had just resigned.
Yeah, what was the situation then?
Well, I think that was only a few weeks after Chris Bowen had become his boss. And I'd have to go back and listen to the interview to get it verbatim, but Paul Broad and Chris Bowen didn't see eye to eye on things like the Curry gas-fired power station, which Snowy Hydro is building. I think is almost built, and I think that's called now the Hunter Valley Power Station, because Chris Bowen came in and said with his mandates for renewables and emissions reduction, he said, well, this needs to be a hydrogen thing. And my guess is that Snowy had already placed orders for the gas turbine, the fuel trains, and all that kind of stuff, and the design was complete, and they were starting to spend money. And then a new boss comes in and said, change it all. And obviously that went from being a $600 million project to almost $1 billion project, which no one really talks about. And this has got to be a direct result of changing your mind at the last minute.
Yeah.
So yeah, my podcast story started there, and it's been some episodes have been more challenging than others. Some you probably experience it as well in your thing. Some fall out more naturally than others, but it's been fun.
So you've called the podcast the Baseload podcast. I find that interesting because apparently baseload is an outdated concept.
Oh, isn't it? Yeah.
So let me quote to you, an energy analyst from LinkedIn that you responded to, just to refresh your memory from in December. Maria Petrovic said, baseload power generation is a business model, not a technical requirement. End quote. Is that true? Is that why you called your podcast the Baseload Podcast? Because actually baseload is still really important, or am I reading into it? Is there a more subtle take that you have?
First of all, baseload is not really a supply side term. It's more talking about the consumption side.
Okay.
The demand side. That's why it's base load, because load is your electricity.
Demand.
Yeah, that's what's using the electricity. So in terms of base load on the supply side, on the demand side, it's always there. You never have deeply fluctuating amounts of electricity. You have seasonal variations and you have your diurnal variations.
Your daily.
And you can have instances where you could have a big transmission line turn off, planned or unplanned. And that changes your demand side things. But these are all generally sort of transient issues. But in general, if you look at it over a long period of time, your baseload is always there. Because you've got people, you've got industries, the power demand is always there, and that's your baseload demand. On the supply side, if you're going to supply that electricity, whether it's the underlying baseload or the peaks and troughs, there is an argument which young Maria has said that you don't need baseload generators to supply that. And from a technical perspective, you could say that's true at some point. but it's not true if you're trying to do it cheaply and reliably.
Okay, so you're saying the demand is always there. That is baseload. So what proportion of the peak is just always there? Like, give me the depth of the ocean. So we can think about demand for energy on the grid as like the height of the ocean, right? So there's the tides, the daily tides.
Yeah.
How much higher is high tide than low tide, and how deep is the ocean if we're thinking about the baseload demand? Is it 50%, or is it actually 80% of the peak?
Okay. So in winter, say in say New South Wales, the biggest region in our grid, I think the difference between, say, your minimum load, which is going to be at sort of nighttime,
Yep.
in the middle of the night, versus your maximum demand, which is going to be in the middle of the day. So if you're on a work day, your base load's still going to be like 50%. But if it's a hot day, like those peaks could stretch that out a bit more and make that gap a bit bigger. The other complication in talking about it is the prevalence of rooftop solar. So rooftop solar is what they call behind the meter. So the market operator can't see how much it's actually generating. They imply what it's generating from the number of kilowatts of installed solar in certain postcodes, an average irradiance level calculated from Bureau of Meteorology stuff. Yep, it's modeled. I love modeling.
Yeah.
And they infer what that does to the grid is that as the solar comes on, you can't see what its output is, but you can see that you don't need as much of grid electricity to balance the frequency.
Yep.
So those generators start backing out as the market operator sees the frequency go up. Yep, drop some more generators out, and eventually they get down to in periods where you've got lots of rooftop solar and not much demand, say a spring or an autumn in South Australia.
Oh yeah. Okay.
Where you get you've got enough rooftop solar to meet all that demand.
So in that case, you've got a situation of basically turning off all the other grid generation just about, and only having enough to balance the frequency.
Yep. Because
all this generation is happening behind people's meter before they demand anything from the grid.
That's correct.
So you've got so baseload is basically half of power we need all the time, no matter what.
Yep.
So why do people say that that's a business model, not a technical requirement? Because it seems to me like you need half the peak on 100% of the time. So 50% of power just needs to be on all the time.
You could literally have your big baseload generators, your synchronous generators, your dispatchable generators, typically your coal, or if you had nuclear, that you could set up a certain amount of those, run them at full output, to meet half your electricity supply forever, and they wouldn't change. There'd be the odd change, but generally they'd just operate flat stick all the way, and that's how it kind of used to be. But those baseload generators, which is the reason they're called baseload generators, because they're always on.
Yeah.
And they're always there to supply the baseload. But one of the misconceptions is that these baseload generators can't ramp up and down. Obviously they can, because if you look at the supply charts of, say, New South Wales, Queensland, South Australia, Victoria, New South Wales being the worst one for the coal plants, they're going from sort of 40% output to 100% output in an afternoon.
Well, they're ramping up and down. Are they ramping up and down more because of more renewables in the system, or
Absolutely.
less?
More.
Right. So there's this. So one thing that is perhaps a misperception is that baseload power can't ramp up and down, but in fact, the more renewables in the system requires gas and coal to ramp up and down more, proving that they can do that and accommodate the normal daily fluctuations in load anyway. Is that basically the story?
Yeah, it is. So
Okay.
what used to happen is you'd have, and still happens largely, you could almost call the rooftop solar and the renewables just disturbances in your normal load, and everything else is made up by coal and gas and a bit of hydro. That's kind of how it still works, and I believe how it will always work. I don't think there's so when people say there's no need for baseload generators anymore, and I had a bit of a dig at her because these experts make these claims and they don't actually back it up with anything. It's frustrating to me, because that seems more like a partisan opinion. It's not really a factual scientific data-driven thing. It's her opinion because, in my opinion, she's exposed to the renewables industry on that side. So if there's more renewables, she has a better business.
Fair enough. So baseload, we kind of need at least 50% of power all the time. We have a plan, an integrated system plan to transition away from fossil fuel to renewables and satisfy this load. And I assume all the experts in all the organizations understand this. There's been a lot of criticism lately about this plan. Can you summarize what it gets right, what it gets wrong, why there's such heated debate? Like, if I was a person out on the street going, all those smart people, they've probably got it right. Tell me why that's not the correct view.
I've been waiting for someone to ask me this question.
Okay. This was unplanned.
So the integrated system plan is, in the words of the CEO, Daniel Westerman, at a December, I think it was, Senate hearing on energy planning and regulation, that integrated system plan is not designed to compare government policies and find the lowest cost outcome or the best most reliable outcome. It's designed to implement government policy, and so that's one of the biggest misconceptions. And it's a misconception that's been, I would say, if not made more popular by the bureaucracies and the AMO and the politicians, etc., it's at least not been disputed by the people who run those organisations. And in my opinion, it should have been. So Westerman and Bowen, etc., are on the record as saying this integrated system plan provides the least cost option, but it does not do that. It does a least cost option within very narrow constraints defined by government policy. So if you had another government policy which said, give me the lowest cost option using nuclear,
yep,
well, you would get something like, give me the lowest cost option to meet these targets, put nuclear in the mix. Then you get Frontier Economics report, which came out recently. If you did one which said, give me the lowest cost option to meet certain targets using coal, you'd get another plan. This is just the lowest cost option to meet the government targets using renewables. And it's not the lowest cost in absolute terms at all.
So it's a little bit like, let me give you an analogy. The government wants to get people from A to B. They send, which organisation does the integrated system plan?
AEMO.
So that's the Australian Energy Market Operator.
Mm-hmm.
So they send the Australian Energy Market Operator to the Ferrari dealership to see if they can move people from A to B. And they go to the Ferrari dealership and say, here's the cheapest way to do it. Buy 25 Ferraris. And they go, see, it's the cheapest cost option. And you're saying, well, hang on a minute. Well, if you limit it to what's for sale at Ferrari dealership, that's not the lowest cost. That's the lowest cost, ignoring the Kia and the Toyota dealership, which could be dramatically cheaper. Now,
that's a pretty good analogy, yeah.
And so how much, like, in your view, do you have a view of, like, how much cheaper these alternatives that aren't being considered might be? You mentioned this Frontier Economics report. What did that do, and how much difference in total system cost? Maybe you better explain the total system cost for how we compare them first, and then say how different approaches, going to the Toyota dealership or having coal, might actually, which parts they might change.
Well, at a high level, the Frontier report simply did, and this is the second report of two. The first report they did reverse engineered AMO's modelling. So they took all the inputs and assumptions and gave it the targets and all the rest of it, and they fiddled the model until they got basically the same numbers that AMO does in terms of dollars and things.
So they tried to replicate it based on what they said.
Yep.
So that they comparing like with like.
So they did that first.
Yep.
And they said, okay, the models, we've got AMO's model, basically. And so now the second report is we do a nuclear scenario. And it's not a coalition model, it's a nuclear scenario to meet the current government's targets, which is different to what an LNP coalition would do, I think, I hope. But so Frontier have come up with a much lower number in terms of the capital costs of meeting these targets within these same constraints. Now, there's AEMO's ISP has a couple of these scenarios, and they call them step change and progressive, and that's really just some arbitrary numbers for the demand side, which is driving these scenarios, which is how much stuff you need to meet the electricity demand. Obviously, a higher electricity demand, you need a lot more stuff, a lot more renewables, wind and solar, transmission, batteries, hydro, all that. But there's another one which is progressive, which is less, I guess, doesn't exaggerate the demand side as much.
So why is there this variation in what people think is needed in terms of electricity demand in the grid? Why is there such? Doesn't it just plod along and grow with GDP?
This is
3%?
it's a really interesting circular argument, because you need the government needs. They've set these targets, right? 82% by 2030 and net zero by 2050
So what's the 82%
of national electricity market electricity generation. So by the end of 2030,
which has to be renewable.
They want zero emissions. So they want it 82% of the terawatt hours that we consume
over a year.
Yeah. In 2030, they want that to be 82% supplied by wind and solar and hydro.
Yep.
And maybe biomass and whatever they determine as renewables on the day. But when you get into the details, so those demand forecasts rely on, there's only a certain way you can get all that renewables in the system to get the net zero. So the demand forecasts rely on the government policy, which pushes those things in. Therefore, you need more stuff. Therefore, it's really circular.
So
it drives itself. And this is the constraints that really bother me about it, and what people don't understand is that a lot of that extra electricity is because of charging electric vehicles and making green hydrogen via electrolysis. But the green hydrogen can only exist because of wind and solar. So you get more wind and solar in the system because you need hydrogen, because you have targets.
Got it. So you're saying that actually increasing your forecast demand makes it easier to add higher percentages of renewables, simply because you can go hydrogen electrolysis, stick it in the desert, chuck a heap of solar panels, include that in the total, and then the percentage of total generation from renewables goes up. Even though that's like an arbitrary, almost a separate like standalone thing. Like we could not connect it to the grid at all. We could just go out to the middle of the desert and make hydrogen with renewables, and then we can include that and go, yeah, demand's up. But look, solar power generation's up as well. That's getting us closer to our 82% of the total.
Yeah, and they use all that stuff as variable. They use all that stuff as variable demand as well, so that it's not just demand that's there all the time. It's demand that suits the rollout of renewables specifically.
Got it. So that demand can just go up and down when the sun's on, basically.
Yeah. So then you've got electrolyzers for green hydrogen operating at like 25% capacity factor.
Right.
Which is just outrageous. It's ridiculous. And you've got all these electric vehicles charging at convenient times. The other thing that they don't talk about, that no one really talks about, is this demand side participation and community energy resources. And this is basically home batteries and EVs, which are a large proportion of them in the modeling is meant to be coordinated. And this is the term they use, is coordinated. So it's not being charged when it's convenient for the user. It's being used as a resource by the system to manage the high renewables. And this is something that bothers me a lot, because there was an interview with Energy Networks Australia, I think it was, another transmission lobby group, and they were saying that there's only 10% participation rate in these coordination activities so far. And I just can't see how the reality will unfold, where you've got all these millions of consumers spending, tens of thousands of dollars each for it to be managed by a third party. I just don't see that happening.
Well, the news was out last week about that. 4,000 households, was it in Gladstone? That comes to mind. Got their air conditioners turned off in the middle of the day because they got a subsidised air conditioner if they
You get $400 off your air conditioner. if you install a remote switching device, which can be operated by the network.
And you're saying that if the demand increase forecasts in the modeling rely on higher demand for electricity, but most of that higher demand is this type of flexible, on-demand, switch it on when the sun's on, switch it off when it's off, like making hydrogen from solar. And if you add that assumption into your model, we can easily boost up the amount of renewables without any system problems, or maybe even with less transmission because the demand side's managing it. And that's how the ISP gets to its 82%. Is that right?
That's part of it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Very interesting.
This is the circular argument side of it that really it's there's no way it's going to work.
Right. That's really interesting. So what else is controversial about it? Like there was a parliamentary inquiry. Was that what it was?
Well,
there had various people saying this plan's silly. Look at these new assumptions. Aidan Morrison, our friend, was there picking it apart. What is this inquiry about? Is that basically to sense check these things and get other opinions because the institutions have kind of gone down this path and the government doesn't actually even know what's available at Toyota dealership because we're on the Ferrari shop? Like, is that what this is for, or is that not even the case?
Well, there's been two inquiries run. One's in the Senate and one's in the House. So you have some MPs asking questions about nuclear rollout and taking it around. That's actually been travelling around the country. So they've been in Adelaide and North Queensland and I think maybe even WA. So there's been some questions raised about challenges on the baseline plan, which is the government's plan, which is the ISP, with all its flaws that are becoming more and more exposed as more people catch on to what's going on. And you had another one run by senators, which is energy planning and regulation in Australia. And that's been targeting or focused on the bureaucracies. So you've had the AEMC, the Market Commission, who sets the rules. You've had the AER, the regulator, who enforces the rules. You've had the market operator, who operates according to the rules, and you've had lobby groups and other people come in and provide testimonies as well. So it's been really interesting, and it's great to have the opportunity to present people with who are going through that process, help them understand like what are some really good questions to ask. So Canavan asked a really good question of Claire Savage, the chair of the energy regulator, said, so which coal-fired power stations in the national electricity market are exposed to export coal prices? And she eventually came up with Eraring and Gladstone, which is pretty right. So what a lot of people don't understand, and this is one of the things that goes all the way through GenCost, all the way through the ISP, all the way out into the newspapers and the public, the lexicon, is that coal's expensive. In reality, the coal we have is not expensive at all, except for very rare occasions, when the world's buying up all the spare coal on the spot market, and some of our coal-fired power stations during the 2022 thing, which was you had flooded mines, you had some unplanned outages, you had amongst planned outages, and then you also had expensive coal and coal shortages. So all that combined to make coal expensive at that time. Every other time, coal is really cheap. So brown coal in Victoria. So you've got your Lorne, Loy Yang A and Loy Yang B, each have their own mines. They can't export that coal. There's no use for that coal except to feed the power station. So if you look up AGL's annual report, which is really good because they've got a brown coal-fired power station and a black coal-fired power station. They've got Loy Yang A in Victoria and Bayswater in New South Wales. The average fuel running cost for them is around $20 a megawatt hour.
Okay, is that high or low? Give me some reference point for someone who doesn't know what fuel should cost or how much. What's the retail price of a megawatt hour then?
Well, the retail price of a megawatt hour is around the $400-500 a megawatt hour.
So out of $400 or $500,
50 cents a kilowatt hour we're looking at.
So out of $400, $20 is the coal at its worst, or on average?
That's in Victoria. It's cheaper than that.
Oh right.
Yeah, it's typically when it is And this is the dollars per megawatt hour and the fuel cost is one thing, then there's the operating cost of owning the plant, right?
Correct.
So combined in Victoria, the whole lot's under $20 a megawatt hour.
Oh, okay. So Victorians
compared
are
with
paying
the cheapest possible PPA for a wind farm in Australia is something like $60 a megawatt hour.
And PPA is?
Power purchase agreements.
Okay.
It's kind of like a fixed price.
So like a long-term fixed price contract from buying energy from wind. How much is that per megawatt hour?
The cheapest would be 60.
60.
And most of it's
Typically
sort of 80
100.
to 100.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so basically coal in Victoria is still $20 a megawatt hour.
It's way cheaper.
The next best is 80 plus, depending on
then you've got Queensland. So Queensland coal-fired generators are in the order of 30
okay.
bucks a megawatt hour.
Why? This is one of my questions I actually prepared for you. So the ISP, the Integrated System Plan, our big plan for transition, doesn't actually consider non-renewable cheap options. It only is constrained to this Ferrari dealership of premium renewables. You're saying that coal is still the cheapest. I find it really funny. Maybe I'd like your opinion on this. If we got in a time machine and went back 20 years, you'd see me studying at QUT, looking at climate change and renewables. And all the talk then was, it doesn't matter if it's more expensive, we have to do it. That's why we subsidize rooftop solar and all these very expensive types of renewable energy generation. And then some point, and I don't know when, all of a sudden we decided, no, renewables are cheaper now. Now, how did that happen? And was it a case of, well, yeah, they're cheaper if China's got coal-fired, solar panel factories? Is there a story there? I don't really get it. I just sort of woke up one day and it went from renewables are expensive, but it's the right thing to do. We're a rich country, we can do it, to renewables are cheaper, turn off the coal, even though it's $20 to $30 a megawatt hour. Where did that come from, in your view?
Well, that's a good question. I think you go back 20 years and you're around about Al Gore era.
Yeah, that's right.
So, and he had his famous charts, and there's all this sort of mumbo jumbo in there about hockey stick graphs and all that. So there's that whole era for me is very tribal. That's the whole climate change discussion and why and how and what's going to happen. So I don't know if it was tribal at the time, but it's certainly become tribal now. It's become tribal to the point where it's almost not worth discussing it, because the people who are in that camp will not acknowledge other factors, and quite a lot of people on the opposite side of the camp just refuse to acknowledge any other factors as well. So
it's classic tribalism.
You've got this great divide in between where the truth lies, which is most things,
But how did the story change? Do you remember first reading that renewables are cheaper? Because you're an electrical engineer, you work in power. Surely you have some ballpark.
Well, I think there is some truth in the matter that the technology has become cheaper to make, and this is partly because of the great volume of it being made around the world. What a lot of the advocates don't necessarily acknowledge is that most of it's done in China. The supply chain for building renewables is mostly in China, and that's all at very low labor costs. There's some slave stuff in there somewhere. I'm not an expert on that, but they also have very cheap energy to make it. They also have very low environmental standards. So all the stuff that we've got in our roofs and in the paddocks is all that. Yep. It's not great for the environment in any way at all. All that people can see is the narrative on their own doorstep, which is that promoted by our friend the CSIRO. This is the cheapest.
So you're saying it's probably just a case of solar panels came down in price, and when we do rooftop solar, that's the main cost for us as consumers, and so that's how we went from very expensive solar to cheap solar as the sort of.
It's very easy to show that solar has gotten cheaper to manufacture.
Yeah, okay.
There's umpteen charts of it all over the place, and the curve comes down and it's flattening out, but it's still very low. And people are still pushing that argument that it's cheap to build, therefore it makes cheap electricity. And that's the link that I'm really trying hard to break, because that's the important one for me.
Well, let's talk about that. given me a mug here, which is terrific. You're the first podcast guest with merchandise. Thank you. I appreciate that. On one side, it says the bill stack, and it's a vertical single bar chart broken down. It's got wholesale costs, network costs, environmental costs, retail costs, and margin. Network costs look about more than half there. Wholesale costs look about a third, and then retail costs, margin, etc., is the other 1/6.
Mm-hmm.
So tell me why solar is cheap to build and install, but the electricity that we buy is not, because I feel like that is really fundamental to this story. People see it in their house and go, well, it's cheap now for my house. And you would probably say that for an electrical grid system, that doesn't really matter because it's a tiny fraction. Can you talk me through the relative magnitudes and why that works?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the numbers you read out there, the rough proportions are about right. 30% is the cost of the generation system. Then you've got sort of 40 to 50%, and growing is the cost of the moving that electricity from the generator to the consumers.
Yep.
And then you've got retail and environmental cost, fees and levies and things and overheads to actually have businesses operate to get you electricity, read your meters, all that kind of stuff. So that's roughly the supply chain of generating electricity to using electricity, not including your toasters. We must separate the grid supply electricity from the rooftop solar stuff. There's very different dynamics going on there, very different cost structures. So if we talk about the grid side of it, none of us are plugged directly into a solar farm or a wind farm or a coal or gas or hydro for that matter. Like there's a whole lot of stuff in between. We mentioned it before: transmission lines, substations, transformers, switchboards, circuit breakers, all that stuff, that protection relays, all the good stuff. And so then all that has to be paid for. But if just putting a cheap generator into the network could, in the early days when there wasn't that much of it, could have reduced the generation cost somewhat. And I think it might have had a price suppressing impact, back when there was maybe 10 or 15% of it. It's very hard to isolate that data from the data, but that's the general feeling I've got.
And you're saying a low cost intermittent renewables generator,
I think there was an opportunity
or
for that
a low
stuff.
cost new coal plant. They would both push the price down in that situation.
Well, there's the argument where if you just put more stuff into the grid, more supply, therefore your cost should come down, right?
Yeah, because you can use the same grid for more throughput if it's matched. Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah.
So the grid utilization isn't a factor anywhere.
Okay.
It's the grid itself, and the transmission grid and the distribution grid, which is the at the moment it's about $110 billion of cost in the system. That's
annual maintenance and capex.
No, that's what they call the regulated asset base, and so the transmission company and distribution companies who own those assets, they get a fixed
regulated return on that
regulated
asset
return.
base.
But it's not based on how much it's used or how much electricity is going through it. It's based on how much stuff there is.
Yeah.
So if you're a asset owner in that environment, your primary goal in life is to have more stuff because you'll get more return.
Yeah. So this is a classic problem. I used to work for the Queensland Competition Authority and the regulated infrastructure, because you get a fixed 8 or 9% or whatever it is return on your asset base. You keep wanting to spend money on it because you get a fixed 8 or 9% on whatever you spend.
So this is really
right?
interesting, right? So back around the sort of 2014 and onwards, you had this term called gold plating.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's since disappeared as soon as the renewables lobby realised they needed a heap more transmission and distribution.
You're saying normally you would try and gold plate, but because of so much more renewables, you actually need to expand the transmission network so much that gold plating is not an issue anymore.
The gold plating was removed from the lexicon, I think, almost overnight.
Okay.
Because as soon as the renewables industry realised they needed a lot more of that stuff, it basically disappeared overnight. You can see it referenced in old newspaper articles up to a certain point. Afterwards, it just stops. It's really interesting. But so we're talking about how cheap solar and wind.
You can add it to the grid. It's cheap to generate, but it doesn't bring down prices.
It's cheap to generate at the point where it connects to the grid, but one of the reasons why it doesn't lower the wholesale price now that there's a lot of it is because it's the volatility that it introduces means that something always has to be there on standby waiting to fill in the gap, or someone has to be paid to drop off, like your aluminium smelters and things. So that's a factor in the cost increase. When you reduce the market share of the things that are there, which can operate whenever you need them to, typically, if they've got lower market share but fixed costs, they're going to charge more per unit, aren't they, for when they can recover that? So that's part of it.
So you're saying if I had introduced lots of just new coal stations into the grid, that would be pretty okay because I can add more of them because they don't have to deal with so much volatility.
If they're on a level playing field competing with each other, then it'd just be that'd be a proper competitive market and would lower the price, right?
But you're saying that the characteristics of the solar generation is that it's not on when you want it. And so to use the generation, you actually need to duplicate that with some gas and on demand. So now you've got two sources of generation to get the same output. Plus solar has to go in certain places to get the sun. So now you need more transmission, both to the gas plant to back it up and to the solar farm. And so to actually manage the volatility, you've got this huge transmission capital expense.
Yeah, and the volatility needs, so then your hydro plants become more critical, and you've got batteries and the peakers and things. The volatility has always been there to some extent, but the volatility is increasing. Some people say it isn't. I had this argument with a guy in one of the bloody infernal chat groups, but it's actually correct that the market volatility is increasing, both in the physical electricity up and down, because something's always got to swap in and back out to make room or take over from the solar, and also in the price. The price volatility is increasing. So this chart here I find is interesting. You might find it interesting from an economics perspective. This is from the Australian Energy Regulator, and it shows growth. It shows the megawatt capacity in the system over time.
So this megawatts are the instantaneous capacity.
Yeah, the nameplate capacity of all the generators, grid generators in the system.
And I can see here it's grown basically, there's a flat section, but it looks like a bit of an exponential curve from the mid-2000s up to now, from about 35,000 megawatts to about 65,000 megawatts. That's the NEM nameplate capacity. So that's if all generators were switched on at their nameplate capacity at the same time.
Theoretically, they could produce.
At the same time.
Yep.
But the capacity of solar, how do they do nameplate capacity for solar? Because obviously at midday there's one capacity, at midnight there's one capacity. Is it time averaged in its location?
That's the capacity factor, but the nameplate capacity is the nameplate capacity.
That's
if it's rated at 100 megawatts, it's given 100 megawatts capacity. So the other interesting part on this chart is the orange line.
So we've got this blue line going up from 35,000 to 65,000 over 20 years.
And that's installed capacity?
That's the installed capacity. We've got an orange line, which is demand on the grid. So that's after rooftop solar and stuff. So that's the grid demand. And that's a flat line from 35,000 to 35,000. It's a bit squiggly, but it's basically a flat line. So you're saying we've built 30,000 megawatts of extra nameplate capacity to deal with the same amount of demand. Is that what you're saying?
We're building a lot more stuff to meet the same demand.
But does this include the nameplate capacity of the behind the meter solar as well?
No. I actually did that in a separate chart. So let me bring this up.
Because obviously that would reduce the demand. It would operate through reduced demands.
You'd think so, but that's kind of why the demand was going up, sort of, and we had just enough capacity to meet demand pretty regularly.
And then we started,
and then it's sort of
behind the meter stuff, so that flattened out.
And look at that seasonal variation. Some years you have more wind and solar. Some years you have less.
I'll see if I can put a link in. If you're listening to this point in the podcast and there's no link, email me. Thanks. So this is a little bit of that point of we've got to duplicate nameplate capacity to deal with variation, right? Is that what?
This is more stuff, right? So for me, the total, you mentioned total system cost before. So the total system cost is what is the cost of all the generators, all the poles and wires, all the people, all the land cruisers cruising around in the regions fixing the poles and wires, all the retailers, all the smart meters, all the other stuff, all the gas plants, all the pipelines, what's needed to meet your electricity demand at any point in time. And what that is going to be very, very high under a renewable system. High renewable system means there's a lot more stuff, and it all costs money. And the only people paying for the stuff is us electricity consumers in our bills. That's the only place you get the money from, as well as taxes and subsidies and things.
I'm trying to think of a good analogy for this required duplication, and I feel like it's like, imagine you've got a teenager who takes your car whenever they feel like it, but it's completely unpredictable. You're going to have 2 cars to have a car whenever you need it. And, so your costs have doubled to have
think of it like
car when you need
think
it.
of it like
got this unpredictable variation.
Coles and Woolies, but they've got people who sometimes come in and sometimes don't, so they've got to basically pay them both just in case. And they're not allowed to say you have to turn up.
Yeah, that's right.
And this is not going to go. This problem of volatility we've got now is not going to go away anytime soon. So let's imagine, say, Peter Dutton wins the federal election in the next few months. Ted O'Brien becomes the energy minister. They get nuclear bans repealed. They go, cool, we're going to set up a government-owned nuclear power company. Just for fun, I'm going to call it, in my head, the Commonwealth Atomic Power Company, CAPCO. So they set up CAPCO, and they go and start community consultation, setting up the bureaucracy, the regulation, all the rest of it. And in 2035, say, they award a contract to someone like Bechtel, who have built nuclear power stations before of their approved design. And Bechtel then, and they also give them a greenfield site, or a brownfield site, sorry, because they're not doing greenfield. They're doing the plan is to do coal-fired power stations. So they'll just buy it off AGL or whoever owns it, whatever, right? So they'll go, okay, good. And that's crude and simplified, but generally by 2035, something might be happening. You've still got a lot of wind and solar in the system. You've still got a lot of rooftop solar in the system. You've still got activist state governments subsidising rooftop solar going into the system. They're even still doing it in South Australia, where the system itself is screaming, please stop putting solar in the grid. It's hurting us. And Perth and Western Australia is similar, and the other states are not far behind. And this is why I quite often say that the rooftop solar is the biggest technical problem and economic problem in our electricity system at the moment, and it will be for a long time. So it's no Ted O'Brien's not going to do all that stuff, start getting nuclear on, and then start pulling rooftop solar off people's roofs. It's going to be there for years, decades. It'll slowly wind down, sure. Subsidies will be off by then, let's hope, but it's still going to be there. So this whole market share problem still exists, and the peaks and the peakiness of the supply. So coming along with nuclear, and people are not going to get cheaper electricity straight away, no matter what. What does affect the price, and we never quite finished this conversation on the wholesale price, is that because the electricity market at the wholesale level is a clearing price. So the market operator goes, well, what's the cheapest generator I need? How much of that can I get? What's the next cheapest? All the way up, they start building this, it's called a bid stack. So they build that up until they reach how much electricity they need every 5 minutes. And obviously there's a lot of planning in advance, but that signal goes out to the generators and go up, go down, depending on the price and the load. So the thing at the top, the last megawatt that comes in at the top sets the price for that 5 minutes. And that's the clearing price, and they all see that price. The rest of the prices don't matter. And the thing that sets the price the highest, well, now it's batteries, but it's gas and hydro. So if you have expensive gas, you have expensive electricity. And I can show you charts all over the country from every state where the wholesale price has a very high correlation with gas price. So that's the thing which will lower electricity prices the most. And we have a lot of gas. But this is one of the things that I think the coalition are, I don't want to say they're being a little bit cute, but they're definitely happy to talk about nuclear versus renewables rather than gas, because gas is tricky for Australia. Bass Strait gas is running out. Longford's going to be closed down in a couple of years. They're already closing units at Longford. And that means our highest gas load in Australia is Victorian domestic consumption in winter to keep the places warm, right? But another thing with the ISP, the Victorian state government's trying to get people off gas onto electricity. At the same time, we're making electricity really expensive and hard to get. So that's another thing. But so the gas demand in Victoria, and then the ISP needs more gas generators operate at even lower utilization. So they'll be even more expensive when they're needed. But they haven't priced in the pipelines or anything that goes with it, of course. So the gas question is the main question for me in terms of getting electricity prices down for consumers. It's really critical. The second one is reverting to a baseload dominated system, baseload supply dominated system, which by that I mean big synchronous generators, not weather variable. Yes, if you have too many, their overall capacity factor reduces, but then the cheapest one runs the most, even better for consumers.
So to reiterate, when the price is set every 5 minutes, as you said, I assume we like a supply curve in economics, we stack up the cheapest up to the highest, and all the cheapest automatically get their bid, and then the price is set by the last person who's needed to satisfy the whole market in that 5 minute block. Is that right?
That's exactly right, yes.
Yeah. So to get prices down, if that price setting method stays, I mean, historically, prices, I think, were just subsidised and arbitrary because we had state power, right?
Let's assume that model stays in the future.
Let's assume that model stays. So we can add more low price generation in the bottom of the curve to push that out, or we can just get more lower price at any point, right? How do you see the best way of lowering prices under this pricing system?
So this is the merit order effect, where that's the term used to describe the bill stack where the cheapest one goes in first and the most expensive one goes in last. I'll phrase the answer to this in a slightly different way. If we look at historically what's happened with the price, the bid stack, which is the merit order effect, we're not shutting down gas plants. We're not shutting down hydro. We're not shutting down batteries, which are all the most expensive ones that come in at the top. We're shutting down the cheap coal ones, the mid merit. We're not shutting down renewables, which are below the zero level, right? In terms of their bids, we're taking it out of the middle. We're not taking it off the top. We're not pushing more in the bottom, which forces the cheap ones to meet the supply. We're taking big chunks of the cheap stuff out and chucking in even cheaper stuff, but the thing that sets the price is still there, unchanged.
And to be clear, during the day, the solar comes in and bids real cheap. Is that right? Typically,
when it's really it kind of has to, right? Because the way wind and solar, because they're weather variable, depending on the weather, and that can change from minute to minute. They're basically dispatched not by what the owners of the power station say they want to bid or generate. They're dispatched by a weather model. So the weather model looks at what's going on in that region and says, here's what we think with a certain amount of accuracy the the megawatt forecast for that power station is. Therefore, that goes into the bid stack. And then there's a variation in that.
And to be clear, when there's a lot of solar all at once, someone else has to turn off. Does other solar have to turn off? So as we get more solar that's all on at the same time, what we've kind of done is get gas to turn off and coal to turn down. But eventually you'll need other solar to turn down on a really sunny day, right?
This is the cannibalization, yes. So, and this is another of the distinctions between the grid-connected solar and the rooftop solar. So the grid-connected solar is controlled by the central market operator, AMO, and it can be turned down. You can tilt the angle of the panels and get less output out of it. But that actually happens a lot. And it happens just as much for solar and wind as the other plants now, because the rooftop solar effect is so great, it takes so much market share during the day that the market operator not only has to balance the frequency and settle the dollars, it has to manage the physics of it as well. So there's fault current, there's reactive power, voltage. There's a few of these things sitting in the background that no one really talks about, but that's the primal concern of the grid. It has to be on. You can't just let it wobble and fall off. You know, people complain if you can't watch, well, you watch Neighbours on Netflix now, but anyway, whatever it is, or on Apple TV or something. But if people can't watch their Home and Away at 7 o'clock at night, they're going to get cranky. The fridges go off, etc. So that electricity has to stay on. The problem with rooftop solar is that and this is what's happening in South Australia quite regularly, is you've got so much rooftop solar and so little demand from the houses and businesses that the rooftop solar can meet all that demand, and then they have to let it trickle out down the interconnector down to the other states to get rid of it. But you need, if a cloud comes over, you've got to have something to fill the gap. So you always have to have something on, and it's batteries are good at that, but they're so small capacity, and once you use it, you can't use it again 5 minutes later. You've got to charge it. So there's this inherent instability in this whole system that we're bringing into it. And so when you look at, say, South Australia, you need to, the market operator forces other generators to stay on, compensates them separately to the market, and they're directed on generators because they need to maintain the physics of the grid. And now your inverter-based resources, which is your wind and solar and batteries, do not have the capability at this point in time to manage that physics. And at some point, because you can't tell them to run when you need them to, batteries you can, but they're limited in capacity, and they're like a one-shot device at that level. You're always going to need something else.
And what happens to the power? Like, is it just heats something up and the heat dissipates, that it's always on, and then it gets switched into the grid? Because you've got this thing running, it's obviously boiling water, and where does the energy that it go when it's not being diverted into the grid?
They make room in the grid for it. And so this is why they're reaching into homes in South Australia with retrofitted devices to turn off rooftop solar.
Because they want that. So
they need the room.
It's equivalent to turning power on, is turning off people's solar to manage that.
Yes.
Yeah, so it's funny, right? Because people will say that, more baseload's not needed, it'll just have to be turned down. But the point is, more solar has to be turned down because it's not only on, it's only on when needs to be turned down right now. And the other crazy thing is we get these other schemes. So we've got this capacity investment scheme, which may or may not last if the government changes. And the idea of that is to force even more solar into the system and wind as well. But it's still competing with the rooftop solar because the rooftop solar has no choice except to be on. There's no controlling it except in small amounts. Unless everyone gets retrofitted with some kind of external control.
And the standards that change. So Australia probably has the weirdest and most changing inverter standards in the world. But I think they're saying, well, it's got to have this capability now. And you've got to have the ability to, I guess they put a SIM card in it. A 4G SIM card that goes back to the network operator, and so AMO can ring them up and say, turn off 10,000 solar.
Wow.
Turn off 500 megawatts of solar, can you?
So that's crazy. So let me ask you then, if we had a time machine and went back 20 years, what would your ideal power network look like? And can you give me a ballpark estimate of what the costs are in the ISP of the path we're on versus what you think, whether it's just leave the coal on and add some gas to accommodate growth? Maybe we should have scrapped rooftop solar much earlier because as it penetrates too much. Talk me through, you're in charge in 2005, let's say, to the pre-financial crisis era, and you can see all this coming. What could have been done? Yeah,
hindsight's fantastic, isn't it, for these assumptions?
Why don't we just make you look real intelligent in hindsight?
First of all, I'll look ahead, and I think that in a couple of decades, we'll be looking back at this rampant rooftop solar exercise as the worst energy policy in history. I honestly think that'll be that bad. We'll be looking back and going, we were idiots. We really ballsed it up. So
why is that?
Because it's the biggest economic and technical problem in the grid. It cannibalizes everything else. You can't turn it on and off. It's very expensive compared to grid electricity.
On a per megawatt hour basis.
It's massively expensive. There's been so much money spent on it. Then you've got the whole Well, if you took it all off and put it in a landfill, that'd be a pretty big landfill. So it's all that part of it. There's the China economic side of it. I think there's no part of it apart from, the economic cross subsidy for people who can afford the thing in the first place. So it's a wealth
upwards
it's a wealth
redistribution.
transfer. The whole thing's none of it's good.
So you think so? But it's
So
20,
if we
we're
go back
20
to
years into
if we
this.
go back to 2020,
Why is this not the standard view now? We've had 20 years of this. Why am I talking to you? I'm not hearing it for the first time because we both know Aidan Morrison and a few other people. Why is this not the standard view after 20 years? Like, because all the facts are there, you're saying. So rooftop solar, worst mistake of the last 2 decades in terms of powering.
If I had the time over, in 2005, I would say, okay, anyone can have rooftop solar. I don't care, but there's no subsidies for it, and you've got to have pay some levy into the to cover your costs of being connected to the grid while you're not actually using the grid.
So instead of what I got in
It'd be the opposite.
Yeah, so in 2005, I think I was getting paid 40 cents a kilowatt hour. I don't know, is that a lot?
2005, probably.
Yeah, it's like double what the normal price was to pay for my rooftop solar to pay into the
But also
grid.
the solar panels and stuff were a lot more expensive back then.
They were. But so I'm paying twice the retail to be a generator, right? But generators don't get twice the retail if I did a commercial solar. So, it's this massive, enormous subsidy to the least efficient way of doing solar.
Yeah, it's incredible. And people call it the democratization of power. Like everyone should have their own dispersed generator. I'm like, no, you're an
disconnect to the grid then.
Yeah.
I mean, that's fair. I mean, if you want to disconnect, do it and see how you go. That's a very different task, right?
Yeah. It's incredibly expensive.
Yeah. And I mean, it was expensive enough 15 to 20 years ago to get solar and connect it to the grid.
You could do it if you're a hippie, say, living in West End, where we are now.
Yeah,
with no. But you in a suburban situation, you can't physically have enough rooftop solar to charge the batteries to keep you in a first world lifestyle.
Yeah, exactly.
It just doesn't work that way.
And so you're saying that in retrospect, with your knowledge, you would have cut that off at the knees.
Yep.
Earlier, and you think, as a prediction, that in the next 5-ish years, that will become general knowledge now that this.
I think it'll take longer than.
You think
5
it'll take
years.
longer than 5 years
for people to admit that it's a massive mistake. Yeah, I think it'll take longer. That's why I reckon in 20 years' time there'll be people writing PhDs and stuff about it, going Australia's energy mistakes.
Okay.
I reckon it's going to be there.
We'll come back. And okay, so what else about... So we would have got rid of that, cut that off. I mean, all your predictions now, what the best is.
I would have aimed for a level playing field. Obviously, I would have made sure there's no nuclear bans. I've thought about this a bit, and there's a really interesting discussion to have around the role of government ownership in critical infrastructure like this. People who are free market say that's crazy, and people who are socialists say you should have all government ownership. There's plenty of them in West End, but I'm of the view that the government should be able to say, if we need to intervene, if something's going on, if something falls over, if someone won't invest and build something, then we have a fallback position, and that fallback position might be 50% of the baseload generators and a couple of peaking plants. And I think that would be a reasonable overhead on taxpayers which would also mean that the pool for the private area is much smaller. So then you wouldn't have these massive organizations which have this huge market power and all these customers and all the generators that go with it, and some of them have their own gas supply as well. So there's a lot of that vertical integration, I think, which we could avoid, and I'd love to see something like that coming down the path. But this is wholesale changes to our electricity system as we know it.
It doesn't seem that crazy. I mean, if I got in a time machine and went back to the 80s, wouldn't that just be normal?
Yeah, and they wouldn't be interconnected either. I would, going back to 2005, I would say. AMO, which was Nemco back then, their role was reasonable. they managed the frequency and they managed the dollars. And they did a little bit of reports on the data and what they might need in the future. That was good. What we've got now is a central planning behemoth, which is out of control, who are setting, they get given a number by the government and their constraints, and they say, yeah, sure, we can do that. And then no one checks it. And it just goes and goes and goes and becomes the narrative. And now all of a sudden, we've got this whole discussion we're having started off talking about baseload, and then we talked about the ISP and all that side of it. I'm really hoping that the next government puts AEMO back in its box and takes away this central planning feature that they have, because I think it's so dangerous. Because one of the things is, say the Energy Connect transmission line between South Australia and New South Wales, Adelaide to Wagga, basically. It's blown out a few times. It was 1.5 billion, then it was 3 billion. Now it's, I don't know, 3.5, 4, something like that, maybe 5. That was originally proposed by, I think, the South Australian government as a way to get cheaper electricity into South Australia, because they're so dependent on gas, that they wanted some cheap New South Wales coal-fired power to come down the interconnector into South Australia to reduce their dependence on gas. Now that whole strategy's morphed over time, and what you'll find is that's all approved through all the processes and all regulatory investment tests, but then they needed cash injections from the Clean Energy Finance Corporation to get it over the line, so it actually made sense economically. I'm like, what? That's a subsidy, doesn't make it make sense. But the New South Wales customers pay more for it than the South Australian customers do, because there's more of it in New South Wales.
Oh, right.
So it adds to the New South Wales bills for the pleasure of reducing the South Australians' bills.
Wow.
What?
So
And the New South Wales people didn't get a say in it.
So can I then ask, if we just basically kept coal on, refurbished, managed, expanded when needed, I guess what I'm trying to ask is, imagine climate change never became accepted wisdom and we just plugged along with our electricity with the same engineers and nerds who managed it in the 70s, 80s,
Coal,
and
gas
90s.
and hydro. Yep.
We'd have coal, gas and hydro still. How much cheaper would our electricity be, do you think?
Heaps.
Like 30%, 50%?
Oh, I think if you look at the charts where we've gone from, and I'm not great on talking about inflation adjustments, but in the 2000s we were $50 to $70 a megawatt hour throughout years. It was dirt cheap. We had some of the cheapest electricity in the world.
50 to 70 wholesale
dollars a megawatt hour, yeah. That's average across the whole thing, including the gas peakers and everything. Gas prices were lower, which is the main thing, and everything was pretty new.
So if we also reserved gas, would that have an effect on Australia's electricity prices? Because I know in the West Coast, the domestic gas price is a third of the export price.
Yep.
And the East Coast, it's kind of, those markets are connected, so everyone locally is connected to the global price.
So this is, earlier I said that gas has to be a topic, and I think this topic of a domestic reserve is one of the things that no one in politics really wants to talk about. Daniel Andrews talked about it a couple of years ago from Victoria, saying that Queensland should have a domestic reserve on Queensland gas, which I thought was interesting, since considering he banned domestic gas exploration in his state. But no, I think one of the mistakes during the Queensland gas boom, the LNG boom, was not having a domestic reserve. I think that should have been put in place. Now, it's actually quite difficult to implement a reserve afterwards, after the stuff's built, because when you think about it, if you're gonna build an LNG plant and you've got the upstream supplies, which is your gas wells and your compressor stations, your pipelines, then you've got your LNG plant and you've got ships and you've got contracts. That's all based on a certain tons or TJs per day of gas, right? Throughput, right? But if you suddenly, if you design all that upstream stuff with an extra 10% so you can supply a domestic reserve, that extra 10% is basically subsidized by the overseas customers. That's why it's cheaper. If you go and implement a reserve afterwards, you're just reducing that LNG throughput, basically. You're taking some away.
Yeah, I mean, I think in Western Australia though, they've got these reserve requirements, but there's like a credit, like a bank of reserve requirements because the domestic demand is so much lower than their export capacity. When they reserve 15%, during a big year of production, they can only
They
actually
can't
use
use it all.
5%.
Yeah.
So they're dripping out their domestic reserve. They're sort of smoothing that out. Look, I don't think these things are impossible. It's all politics and who wears the costs.
I think there's a pathway to it, and I actually think we're going to have to do it no matter what.
Yeah, so I mean, you can give people a few years to adjust, and you can build it up incrementally and let them work out, how to manage this new thing.
The absolute best way would be to get more gas, fill up, oversupply the LNG trains, so you've got stuff that can't be exported.
So you're saying make the export capacity the limiting constraint, and then it's no big deal because that capital's fully utilized.
The other mistake, as well as not introducing a reserve, they allowed 3 separate entities to build 3 separate LNG plants, which is I think they've only ever got up to about 80% capacity. I think the Santos ones have never been full, which is one of the reasons they're pulling gas from Moomba, right?
That's my understanding. There's a huge amount of export capacity, and everyone's like, whatever gas we can get, we should sell there into that market. I feel like that was a bit of a mistake, foreseeable by many people, I think, at the time.
Mm-hmm.
So climate change. I think I want to wrap up and say we talked about the cheapest cost of getting electricity and the issue with variation in renewables, and how the ISP, the plan for our future, is based on this arbitrary 82% target. I guess my thinking on climate has evolved. I thought it was pretty important 25 years ago. I did a lot of study on it. A lot of the actions seemed a little bit disconnected from the reality. It was like, okay, Australia's what percent of emissions of methane and carbon dioxide, and how is that going to change the temperature in 50 years, given, business as usual in the rest of the world?
Leadership, Cameron.
Well, yeah.
A moral obligation.
So there's so many, there's so many links in this chain of logic, right? Like, is the climate changing? Okay, we can agree on that. Is it man-made? Okay, there's another link. Well, that's harder to discern. Can Australia, economically... Well, no, sorry. What are the costs and benefits, right? Because I'm sure a lot of cold places are fine if it's warmer, right? What's the net cost and benefits? And then, you go to how much can Australia do? How much does that affect? And all these links in the chain, you get to the point where you're like, I don't think anyone actually cares that much. China doesn't actually care. The Middle East doesn't actually care. India doesn't actually care. And we're here being global leaders. And what are we paying for it?
It wouldn't surprise me if...
hundreds of billions per year.
Yeah.
What's your take on this whole story now? Should we just forget about it and go, look, keep our domestic air clean in the cities and do our best, and, we'll manage the climate if it happens to change?
The domestic air in the cities has gradually improved with fuel-injected cars, catalytic converters, very low particulate diesel, all that stuff.
Getting lead out of petrol is helpful.
All that stuff. I think the same guy who put lead in petrol put CFCs in aerosols or refrigerants, whatever it was. No, I like to come at it from a slightly different angle and say, well, who benefits from climate change? And it's certainly not Western economies. Western economies are struggling, trying to deal with not actual climate change, dealing with transitioning to alternate out of fossil fuels. Who's benefiting from it? Well, China's benefiting significantly from it. Germany is not, UK is not, Australia is not, California is not. Speaking of the US, I think Trump is certainly going to... I spoke to Doomberg on my podcast, and he said...
Yeah, listen to that. It was a good one. I'll put a link in.
Yeah, cool, thanks. He said that Trump will be like a baseball bat to the kneecaps of the climate lobby. Like Trump's not going to hold back this time. He's got a significant amount of people, and that's going to have effects on Europe and Australia.
So do you think we'll just follow along, American cultural narrative, we'll just follow American politics? the rest of the world would just go, oh, we should switch back on our nuclear. I mean, I think I've seen that happen in the last few months in Japan and elsewhere.
Well, Japan's really interesting because they don't really have a choice. They don't have any natural resources. And that's why they're quite happy to build very expensive coal-fired power stations, these advanced ultra supercritical things, whatever they are, very high pressure, very high temperature, because they want to get their most bang for buck out of every kilogram of coal that they've got to import in a ship. So they're quite happy to do that. I think Trump's more interested in energy security and self-sufficiency, and also one other aspects that I think people overlook is that if Trump gets his oil and gas export plan underway, that's going to make global oil and gas prices a lot cheaper, which is actually good for Australian consumers, because if global gas prices drop, then as we talked about earlier, our domestic electricity prices will fall. That'll be good. It won't be so good for the royalties and stuff on the the LNG plants, but it'll also affect, say, other global actors like Vladimir Putin. So he's making a lot of money selling gas and oil and coal. Well, if it's cheaper to buy from America, he's going to have to drop his prices. And so he won't have as much money to be this, whatever he wants to do. So this will have big implications. And it's an incredible thing that, the world wants to put Putin back in his place, but is quite happy to
keep the gas price
let him
up.
make billions out of his oil and gas assets, by not flooding the market with gas and oil and just taking that away from him. So I think in the next decade, because I honestly think the US has turned a corner and they're not going to go back to like a Hillary Clinton type administration anytime soon. And I think especially after a couple of years in, when people see the benefits to their actual hip pockets and their freedoms, and the civil society, because the out of control immigration, all that sort of stuff, I think the rest of the world's going to have to follow, and I think Australia will be right in there. And I think, and we've got this AUKUS deal with the subs, so there's a lot going on in that arrangement, and I think Australia will just have to follow along. And there's no point us. You had a really good introduction to this topic about the climate change. You listed out a whole shopping list full of discussion topics, and they're all perfectly valid. So there's no point Australia, shooting ourselves in the foot when we've got this incredible opportunity to flourish. And if you look at what happened with Justin Trudeau, so he's not contesting the next election, he's out, and you've got this Pierre Poilievre who's saying axe the carbon tax, and I'm like, I'm just like, thank you. Let's go.
Yeah. So do you think, given all that context, will there be new nuclear resurgence if the US goes down that path? And do you think we'll see Australia build new coal-fired power stations in the next decade?
I think you'll definitely see a resurgence of nuclear power in America. I think Trump is a fan of nuclear. I think he'll choose where they go, though I don't think he's going to try and put people close coal mines. I'll be surprised if a single coal mine closes under Trump, to be honest, which means that's all going to stay on there. But he'll definitely be after energy security, and he's not a fan of wind turbines. And a lot of the people in his administration are not either. Over here, I think we'll definitely get the ban lifted, whether it's under a next LNP or whether it's I don't think, even if Labor wins, I don't think Albanese would be the leader, and I think that'd be an ideal opportunity for a fresh-faced Labor Party to actually get on board with what most of the population of Australia wants, which is to at least repeal the bans. I think there is a possibility of a coal-fired power station in Australia, but it would definitely need a lot of government subsidies, and it would only be because there'd be an obvious striking need for it. So one of the things I think that's going to have to happen, if we talked about like, imagine Dutton gets in, O'Brien becomes a thing. I think you can't force a private company who owns a coal-fired power station to run at a loss. They give their 3 years notice, they can pack up and walk away. That's it. That's kind of how it works at the moment.
But why, if it's cheaper than renewables, why isn't there a return from opening a new coal power station?
Market share.
What
Because
does
it
that
costs
mean?
because it costs a lot to build a coal-fired power station. If you're going to spend $3 or $4 billion building a 2-unit, 1,200 megawatt coal-fired power station, you want it to run
Yeah.
a lot.
And so why wouldn't it is this
Rooftop solar and renewables?
So because of the design of the market.
There, it'll go like this.
So how does a solar farm get on? Because it goes like that too. It's only on in the day when it's low. Like who's funding that then? How does that make a return? Because it's only on during the day.
Well, if it was a level playing field in the market and everyone had equal access to the grid and equal access to consumers, then it wouldn't exist at all. What you have is a renewable energy target beefed up by Kevin Rudd, dropped back down by Tony Abbott, and so that forces retailers to have a certain proportion of their electricity they buy come from an approved renewable generator.
So you're saying under the current market rules, you actually couldn't get up cheap baseload generation.
Correct. No private company is going to build a baseload generator in Australia ever again.
And so we've basically designed a set of rules to encourage private companies to get a return on expensive variable generation.
So
cheap but variable generation
cheap
only.
To build
cheap
and
to
operate,
build generation, but highly variable, and subsidize that through lots of public funding of transmission and backup.
There's no penalty on variability.
There's no penalty on variability. The only penalty is we're paying for extra transmission and duplicating on-demand generation.
Yeah, so the consumer wears it all.
So how does this process unwind? Like, it sounds like there's such an entangled web of procedures and market things. Many people have to...
This is the exact same question that needs to be asked of the politicians. If you ask Chris Bowen, he just says more renewables will make it cheaper, and that's the end of the story. If you ask Ted O'Brien, he'd say we need to get back to a baseload system and we're going to build some nuclear plants to stabilise it, and that's great. And then we have my previous comments about gas as well, which is the unspoken topic at the moment. What I think is going to have to happen is there will be some more wind and solar projects built, although not as many as people think, because the transmission, just like, you can't build it if you can't sell the electricity, right?
Yeah.
So what's gonna happen is some of those will get built no matter who's in charge of the government.
Yeah.
No matter what flavour of politics it is. And so of course the rooftop solar is controlled by states, which has got nothing to do with the feds. And so they are going to continue to subsidise rooftop solar, and partly because they're the opposite political flavour, and partly because they think there's votes in it. Now, you can't force a private company who owns a coal-fired, one of the existing ones, to run it at a loss. That's no one would accept that. So what's going to happen? But you also can't afford for them to turn off. What do we do? I think they're going to have like a caretaker period, and I think this could run for decades.
Of the government basically saying, you guys got us in a pickle, we're taking control, we're going to put some actual engineers in there to work things out and forget all your political fights.
I don't think it'll be that complicated. In my simple brain, admittedly, I see the caretaker period. So the coal-fired power station, they say, yeah, here's my 3 years notice and I'm going to close, which is exactly what Araring did. And then New South Wales government stepped in and said, no, thanks.
Oh, so you're just talking about the coal stations only, the current ones?
Yes.
Not like the whole system of everyone and saying,
No, I'm just talking just
we're
the coal.
nationalising the grid and all the generations.
I'm just talking to say, if you just take the coal-fired power stations, except for the ones in Queensland,
yep.
And there's one in Queensland that's private, the rest of them are all private companies. So I think a caretaker, they'd go, right, we're putting a hand up, we're going to close this thing in a couple of years. It's not economic anymore, even though it's got, say, 15 years of technical life left in it, and with refurbishments even more, we're going to close it. The government of the day then says, okay, we want you to go into the caretaker period. We want you to go into the caretaker period, and we're not going to take no for an answer, whatever that looks like. So I see that as you're going to basically have an open book system with us on costs, and you're going to operate it and maintain it, and there's going to be a maintenance guarantee, and we, the taxpayer, will guarantee you a fixed return for that period. And that is going to be a lot cheaper than trying to fill the gaps with batteries and new hydro and wind and solar.
And you think once they do that and they see the books, they'll just be like, we'll just keep this going another 10 years. quite likely.
Entirely possible.
That's crazy.
Until they get and this is going to be part of the nuclear swap over, right? Because all governments of all flavours are still saying net zero by 2050. And I think that's the big one that has to go.
So, that's the same issue with nuclear, right? Is that there's no return on baseload right now because of the variation in the system.
Yep.
And which is that why the Liberals have gone, we're making this state-owned so we can basically, or federally government-owned so we can preference ourselves in the grid and sell it.
Well, I think...
And let you guys deal with the non-baseload variation.
I think there's an element, you have to give them a little bit of credit for saying that the electricity system is pretty important. It's kind of like water. You can't do without it, right? It has to be there.
It's almost a sign of being a wealthy nation is having reliable power 24 hours a day.
Plenty of it.
Like, there's no rich country that doesn't
If it was
have
cheaper,
that.
We'd be wealthier.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's true of everything, though.
Yeah.
My economist hat.
So I think we can't afford to let them close. I think a reasonable government would say, all right, a caretaker period. It's got to be pretty open book with us so that we know we're not getting ripped off, and we've got a due diligence for the taxpayer to make this as cheap as possible. And it could be a 5-year, 10-year period, whatever it is. It could be open-ended, but there's a maintenance guarantee that goes with it. Yes, we need to see those costs, and there's going to be some performance stuff, maybe some penalties if you don't comply. That kind of arrangement, I think, would keep the grid running, and I think it would keep it pretty cheap because then you'd be a lot less price gouging. Like the AGL or the Origin or whoever, Energy Australia, would still own the asset and be getting a return, but it's not. I wouldn't expect it to be a hugely variable return. It'd just be plus.
Like
the other thing is, like, you keep the jobs. You keep all the people employed. There's the maintenance guarantee, so it will be probably more money spent on those units than is currently spent. I think that's for sure. But I also think that there's no way around it.
Yeah, because that's the cheapest way to keep the lights on, as you see it.
Yeah, and
when the reality of those plants shutting down hits, everyone will suddenly realise that actually keeping them on was the cheapest the whole time, and we just pretended until now.
So no one thought that Eraring was going to close when Frank Calabria announced it back in 2021 or 2022, whenever he said, and that's now 2025 after the 3-year period, and it was meant to close this year, I think. And New South Wales stepped in, Labor government, but Chris Minns seems like a pretty decent kind of guy, and obviously did the right thing. I don't think there's any huge cost on New South Wales taxpayers on that. I think it's an opt-in arrangement, and the Eraring Origin can recover a certain amount of costs if they make a loss, but they've also got to hand over some profit if they make a profit.
Oh, yeah.
So I don't think there's too much problem in it for the taxpayers, and that model might be something that could be expanded or improved on down the track. But I think in 2028, when it is meant to close, you've also got your lawn in Victoria meant to close as well. So this is going to be 4,000 odd megawatts of coal gone in the same year, and that's not going to happen either. So, but the problem with the Eraring is it's also got fuel issues. Like it doesn't have its own coal mine. When it was built back in the 80s by New South Wales, SEC, whatever they were called, it was meant to get its own coal mine, Coggera, I think it was called, but they never built it. So when they privatised, they originally sold off let me get this right, they originally sold off the operating rights. So Origin bought that for quite a lot of money, I think not quite $1 billion, somewhere around that in the early 2000s. And then they were operating it, but they didn't own it. But then they bought it under the Baird government privatisations.
Okay.
In somewhere in the 2013s, and they bought it. It was dirt cheap, like $50 million, something like that, for the biggest power station in the country. But then the New South Wales government, they only bought it because the New South Wales government said, well, here's $300 million for some fuel because we don't have a mine. So they buy all that.
But there is coal nearby that they could mine.
There's heaps of it, but I don't think the coal mine is feasible anymore because of landowners and things like that. So Eraring has its issues. It's also got a problem with its ash dam, its tailings dam. I think it's full because there was some contract where you're meant to use the ash in cement, production, but that fell through, and then there's some other issues with it. So Eraring does have some tricky parts to it, even though it could run for ages.
So let's bring it all together. We've been talking for a long time. I don't like the 3-hour Joe Rogan version, but sort of covered that baseload is a real thing, that we're going to this really variable system, that the transmission is literally half the retail cost. And even though per nameplate solar is pretty cheap, nameplate capacity is not
a good indicator.
Not one-to-one related to what you pay retail, because it varies so much, right? Is there anything we should wrap up on? You're an engineer. You've got specialist knowledge about the electricity generation. Is there something that you've realized most people don't understand about energy and power that you often come across that is sort of distorting the debate? Or do you think most people have a pretty fair judge of how the system works?
Oh, I think there's a spectrum. I think there's two parts to it. First part is the physical reality of electricity. And a lot of people who haven't been to a proper power station, I mean, it's an incredible machine. Like, there's a lot going on in a coal-fired power station, a hell of a lot of things, and it's really impressive. They don't realise, first of all, how complicated it is to get it up and running and keep it on. And people also don't realise how sensitive it can be to disruption. It operates within tolerances, and you go outside those tolerances, you could have what they call cascading failure very rapidly. Oh, right. Something happened like that in the US in the 2000s, and they blacked out like a couple of states, which is 100 million people. And that's a big deal. So
it's not what we might think of as just like shoveling coal in a boiler of an old steam train. Like there's just a conveyor belt of coal going in, and then there's a big boiler, and there's it's incredibly complicated. There's a lot of just actual physics and engineering behind it, and a lot of people in it. And it hasn't just appeared overnight. It's evolved. This is a machine that's 150 years in the making to get to this point, and we're slowly eroding its capabilities with this variability that we're introducing to it, which is a real shame. So people shouldn't take it for granted. They should really care about the quality and the capabilities of the electricity system, because it is so critical. You and me, we could probably go for a couple of days without electricity, but if you're on a dialysis machine, for example, which some people are, or if you're elderly, or and you need to cook, or you've got refrigerator, it's just, it has to be there, right? And communications as well. So don't take it for granted is my advice. Find out as much about it as you can. Be like me, be skeptical of everything. Don't believe everything you hear. Don't even believe what I say. Go and read it for yourself. Please do. And then tell me when I'm right or wrong. Oh, that's a great place to end, Ben. Really appreciate your time today and getting into those details on the electricity system. We do have to reconvene in 20 years to check on your forecast, but maybe we should do it before that as well. With the new Trump administration, I think this election period, or this political cycle in the US, might really have some cascading changes on how the world views energy. So let's find out. Thanks again.
Thanks, Cameron.